On the cool dawn of Tuesday, April 24, 2025, the USS William P. Lawrence cut through the Taiwan Strait like molten gold, and her wake was the only sound breaking the vast, uneasy stillness. But here's the question no one wanted to answer that morning. What happens when two nuclear powers disagree on who's allowed to sail first, and neither side plans to blink? On the surface, it seemed like just another patrol, another routine logbook entry, yet beneath it, the air was thick with tension. As the ship pressed onward, China had no intention of allowing an outsider to traverse their waters, and they were about to make that unmistakably clear. The American destroyer crossed into Beijing's claimed waters, and the PLA's Eastern Theater Command immediately went into a frenzy. China didn't waste time in getting their jets ready, converging their warships as their state media exploded with live feeds, leaked drone footage, and radar tracks posted like game stats. This wasn't a legal debate. It was about who gets to decide the rules when guns are close and nerves are thin. Their message to the US was blunt. They didn't want any American warships on their turf, and were ready to retaliate if America dared to react wrongly. And America's response? Dead silence. Just 9,000 tons of steel cutting through contested waters, holding course like a blade through silk. To the Navy, this was just an ordinary Tuesday. But to China, America just showed them the middle finger. That destroyer wasn't just making an abstract point about freedom of navigation. She was threading a razor's edge, where one wrong move could turn a standoff into a shooting war in seconds. And the next 12 hours would decide how far either side was truly willing to go. Beijing's propaganda machine has always screamed about illegal trespassing and regional threats. Why? Beijing doesn't consider the Taiwan Strait to be international waters. To them, it's a domestic hallway, their backyard, and part of what they call their internal sea. For years, they've been selling the story that the rules are different here, and that Western warships need to knock before entering. However, international law disagrees. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which China also signed, calls the Taiwan Strait an international waterway. America treated it like any other busy waterway, like Gibraltar or the English Channel, just another route for its warships to pass through. So the destroyer just continued with precision through the strait, exactly where international maritime law says she belongs. This action said one thing clearly: they don't ask or negotiate, they sail without needing anyone's permission. Here's where the game turns deadly. The USS Lawrence didn't sail alone. The destroyer kept her AIS beacon dark, but satellites overhead pumped live data to Pacific Command. A Virginia-class submarine ghosted nearby with passive sonar tracking everything. Because even if it was just passing through China's waters, you don't walk into an ambush without firepower in the shadows. And the Chinese naval intelligence knew it. Hours later, Beijing releases grainy footage. A Type 0 52D destroyer trailing the Americans at a safe distance. J-16 fighters buzzed close enough to make a point, but careful enough to avoid triggering a response. PLA pilots play this game constantly, pushing boundaries to see who blinks. But there's a line every professional knows exists, and crossing it means the Aegis combat system goes from standby to weapons hot. One radar lock, one misjudged maneuver, one nervous pilot. That's all it takes to make diplomatic statements irrelevant. 12 hours later, the US destroyer completed her transit. No incident, no deviation, but that quiet wasn't peace settling in. That was the fuse burning. As the Lawrence disappeared into the Pacific haze, another pressure point ignited a few hundred miles south. More warships were moving with purpose. The Philippines and the United States launched Exercise Balikatan, their largest joint military drill to date. Over 14,000 troops moved like clockwork, backed by a fleet of warships, squadrons of fighter jets, and missile batteries, rehearsing coordinated strikes across multiple islands, as if preparing for real war. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It was choreography. Within hours of China's declaration, US Marines rolled HIMARS rocket systems onto a Philippine beach, quickly establishing firing positions within range of the disputed waters. It was a show of force, yes, but also a clear signal aimed straight at Beijing. Military planners call it shaping the battle space. China heard it loud and clear, especially since Beijing had flexed its own muscle days earlier. A carrier strike group led by the Shandong had cruised past the Philippines' northern coast, well within the country's exclusive economic zone. But the Philippines refused to back down. While Chinese outlets released propaganda footage, US Pacific Command quietly compiled intelligence data from satellites, drones and surface vessels. Every maneuver was logged, every threatening flyover was documented, and every sailing ship's movement was filed away. And behind every calm Pentagon statement, one question hung heavy. How far would China push before someone made a mistake? Because if this is the opening act of something worse, then every move isn't simply about deterrence. It's a dress rehearsal for war. As the USS warship exited the strait and US forces ramped up exercises, the Chinese Communist Party kicked into overdrive. The PLA's Eastern Theater Command issued a second statement, sharper, louder, more direct, using words like illegal, provocative, and irresponsible not as suggestions, but accusations with teeth. China wasn't just angry that an American warship sailed through waters they claim. They were pissed it happened without asking Beijing's permission, while US allies run live fire drills south and intelligence platforms map coastlines north. That wasn't a coincidence, it was deliberate counter-pressure. By the time the Lawrence cleared the eastern edge, the region wasn't holding its breath anymore. It was preparing for what would come next. In Beijing, the PLA began rotating assets faster than normal. Frigates supposedly in maintenance suddenly put to sea. Aerial patrols intensified and ferries reported unexplained radar interference, possibly signals from airborne early warning aircraft sweeping for American submarines. On the American side, Strike Group 5 didn't slow down. The Lawrence rejoined its formation, including the carrier USS Carl Vinson, steaming east with an escort wall of destroyers. Overhead, P-8 Poseidons looped endlessly, scanning for missile signatures, surface threats, or coordinated drone swarms. No one was standing down. Everyone was loading the board, because while no missiles flew and no shots were fired, the rules had shifted, and China had assumed America was risk-averse and that Washington would flinch at escalation. But the Lawrence didn't hesitate. She just sailed. And if that becomes the norm, then China's entire strategy, its gray zone operations, its incremental territorial control, starts unraveling. Beijing knew this. That's why the propaganda screamed so loud, and footage of PLA destroyers tailing the Lawrence played on repeat for domestic audiences, desperate to believe their government was still in control. But control wasn't about following someone's ship while complaining. It was about deciding what happens next. And in that moment, the only forces shaping their region's movements wore US Navy patches. The US tested Beijing's willingness to back threats with action and how far the PLA would push before hesitating. But Beijing got shaken enough to question everything they thought they knew. For years, China played the long game. They believed America would eventually quit babysitting the Pacific, that Taiwan would feel alone and give up, and alliances would crumble on their own. But they were dead wrong. Every drill like Balikatan made the threat sharper. Every destroyer that passes through without flinching proves Beijing's warnings are empty. And every time China tried to intimidate, no one backed down. The response only pushed harder. And that's where this becomes truly dangerous. When unpredictability becomes the default in a region packed with advanced weapons, catastrophic miscalculation becomes inevitable. One misread radar blip, one nervous pilot, or one wrong move at the wrong time is all it takes for everything to explode. And suddenly, we would not be talking about routine transits anymore, but about actual war between nuclear-armed powers. For now, all sides are quiet, but don't mistake that silence for peace. The Taiwan Strait stopped being just disputed waters a long time ago. It's a loaded trigger zone, where decisions are made in seconds and mistakes are paid for in lives. And every military across the Indo-Pacific is watching, not to learn, but to prepare. Because the next encounter may not come with warnings. It may not come with press statements or emergency phone calls. It could come fast, loud, and irreversible. And once the first shot is fired, control doesn't belong to politicians anymore. It belongs to momentum. By the time explanations arrive, the damage won't just be done. The rules will already be rewritten. The red lines will already be crossed. And the war everyone said they didn't want may already be underway.